The Israelites suffered brutal slavery in Egypt, forced to perform grueling labor. Their pain was immense, marked by tears and despair, deprived of freedom and suffering from hunger. Egypt, in its oppression, became the embodiment of absolute evil, a symbol of tyranny. Even in the deepest darkness, the hope of redemption and liberation never died out. Faith in a better future, free from chains, illuminated the path to a new life. Parashat Vayechi.
Shalom, welcome. Thank you for joining us again on La Mishna TV. Today we are studying Parashat Vayechi, the last portion of the book of Genesis. And I will say this with all the seriousness it deserves. Vayechi is not a farewell, and whoever reads it as a pious testament is missing the most dangerous message of the text. I haven't come to explain. I've come to warn. Because this parashah should not be translated as "and he lived," but as "and he survived." And in this class, we will explain these details. For years, we have learned to read Vayechi with different eyes. Not as the end of Jacob, the patriarch, but as a manual for spiritual survival when the system in which you live wants to devour you from within. Because Vayechi speaks of Egypt, and Egypt is never just a country. In the Torah, Egypt is a complete civilizational model. It is a system that absolutizes power, normalizes idolatry, centralizes the economy to the point of erasing the individual, and, most seriously, anesthetizes spiritual consciousness without you even realizing it. And this, precisely this, although perhaps with other nuances, is something we all suffer in each of our countries. Because it is not a jurisdiction, it never was, but rather a system. That is the real danger. But the Torah, which is medicine for the soul, gives us the solution encoded in this parashah. It's not about chains or whips, not always. It's about something more sophisticated, the domination of the mind, of ethics, and of memory. An environment that doesn't forbid you to believe, but teaches you to forget. That doesn't force you to renounce your identity, but redefines it until it is emptied of meaning. And here comes the warning. Parashat Vayechi was written for people who believe they are safe, for those who have already adapted too well, for those who confuse prosperity with redemption and stability with truth. It is precisely those who succumb to the system who are destined for slavery. I read Vayechi and I hear an alarm, a voice that tells me, beware of the system that feeds you but steals your soul. Beware of the empire that doesn't pursue you, because it has already absorbed you. The complexity is real. The danger is silent. And whoever doesn't read Vayechi as a warning risks living under the illusion of being alive spiritually, when in reality, their soul is asleep. This is Abel Flores, happy that you are studying with us. I remind you that you can leave your comments and questions in the comments section of this video, and I will personally respond to all of them. Let's begin. I'm going to say this carefully because it's a delicate and profoundly dangerous topic if misunderstood. In tradition, the so-called 49 gates of impurity, in Hebrew, Sha'arei Tumah, are not a technical list of sins, nor a moral catalog for pointing fingers. I don't understand them that way, and neither does the deeper tradition. They are a map, a progressive map of the degradation of consciousness. The source that clearly establishes the number 49 is the Zohar Kadash, especially in the Yitro section, and later texts such as Kav HaYashar develop the idea. The Talmud and Midrash describe the process, but it's the Kabbalah that systematizes it. And here is the fundamental key, before any enumeration. 49 is not an arbitrary number. It's the maximum possible level of human impurity. The 50th gate is not a little more. It's the point of no return. It's spiritual annihilation. That is why Israel reached the 49th gate, but did not cross the 50th. And that is why the Exodus was possible. Egypt doesn't sin. This is crucial. Egypt reprograms the mind. Each gate is a level of normalization of the imperial system until the unacceptable becomes commonplace and the sacred becomes irrelevant. We don't read these gates as ancient history. We read them as a living warning. Because no empire begins by demanding your soul. It begins by asking you to adapt. Now don't go away, because we are going to begin enumerating each of the 49 impurities of Egypt one by one, and you will be surprised by the precision and relevance with which the Kabbalah teaches it. I'm going to proceed carefully, because this is where the truly dangerous area of the map begins. The first 10 gates of impurity in Egypt don't attack faith. They attack something more fundamental, inner autonomy. And when that falls, everything else falls afterward. I call them the gates of material dependence, and they are the first 10 of the 49. The Egyptian system doesn't begin by persecuting ideas. It begins by offering bread. But that bread comes at a price. Total dependence on the state for survival. Absolute centralization of the economy. Progressive annulment of personal or private property. What was once yours is now managed. Identity ceases to be who you are and becomes what you are useful for. Pure productive function. Work without transcendent meaning. You don't work to live with dignity. You work to keep working. Security in exchange for freedom. And the most serious consequence, the normalization of servitude, presented as order and stability. Here a silent loss appears. Time. It no longer belongs to you. Your life is oriented solely toward survival, not to thinking, not to remembering, not to dreaming, only to not losing your livelihood. And fear becomes permanent, because whoever controls your bread controls your conscience. The Torah states it without euphemisms. There was no bread, and Joseph acquired all the land. In Genesis 47. This is not a judgment against Joseph. It is an X-ray of Egypt, showing that there was no private property or individual rights. I read about these gates, and I don't see antiquity. I see a system that first takes away what is material, so that you then surrender what is spiritual without even realizing it. It's a perverse and contemporary system. Worrying. I'm going to say this clearly, because here the patriarch Jacob teaches us something that makes any empire uncomfortable. It is possible to live in Egypt without belonging to Egypt, but that requires awareness, courage, and theological resistance. That is, true and complete faith, not merely cultural. Jacob lives in Egypt. He benefits from its economy, inhabits its territory, accepts its political reality. But he deliberately refuses to integrate spiritually into the system. His body is there. His identity is not. That's why his request is not sentimental. It's strategic. Do not bury me in Egypt. You will carry me and bury me in the burial place of my fathers. He says in Genesis 47:29-30. I don't hear nostalgia. I hear resistance. And it's not a cultural matter. It's not about what clothes he wore, but how he dressed, his modesty. It's not about what he ate, but how he ate. And so, both the patriarch Jacob and his son Joseph lived in Egypt within the system. But they did not share its values. This is the point. The Midrash Tanhuma, Vayechi 3, explains that Jacob feared that the Egyptians would turn him into an object of idolatrous worship. Egypt doesn't just dominate. Egypt sacralizes what it controls. It turns figures of authority into religious symbols of power. Jacob understands this perfectly. Accepting to be buried in Egypt would have meant spiritually legitimizing the empire, serving idols. Telling it, your system not only governs life, but also gives meaning to death. And Jacob does not concede this, because idolatry is a capital sin in the Torah. That's why Bereshit Rabbah 96:5, another Midrash, calls this request true kindness. Kindness without reward. Fidelity that does not seek the system's approval or the applause of power. I see a fundamental principle here. It is possible to live within the system without belonging to it inwardly. And that is what the Torah truly requires of us. Not to live outside the system, but to fulfill the Torah within the system. But the price is high, because resistance is not always about fleeing. Sometimes resistance is simply refusing to be buried where you don't belong. Furthermore, the theme of resurrection is the true underlying reason why Jacob wanted to be buried in the land of Israel. Because according to tradition, the first to be resurrected will rise there when the days of the Messiah arrive. Now, don't go away, because we will be studying the next 10 gates of Egyptian impurity. Now we enter an even more subtle and dangerous zone. If the first 10 gates bind you out of necessity, these bind you through meaning. I call them the gates of the idolatry of power. Here the system no longer merely manages life. Here it is sacralized. Egypt deifies the pharaoh, not as a metaphor, but as a theological principle. The state becomes the source of truth. Reality is what power defines as real. Good is what strengthens the empire. Evil is what questions it. That is, the state is God. The system is God itself. Power ceases to be a means and becomes a supreme value. And then something decisive happens. Religion no longer confronts the empire. It becomes subordinate to it. It becomes spiritual window dressing for the system. Authority is sacralized. Disobedience is no longer a political error. It is heresy. Here, the political and the divine are deliberately conflated. Obedience is presented as the highest virtue. Not justice, not truth, not compassion. Obedience. And fear ceases to be ordinary fear. It transforms into reverential fear. A fear that resembles faith far too closely. Domination no longer needs to be justified by force. It is justified morally. It's for your own good. It's the natural order. It has always been this way. And little by little, a person's identity becomes defined by the dominant power. You are what the system says you are. The Midrash summarizes it with a disturbing phrase: Egypt worshipped what it controlled. And I add something even more unsettling. When power becomes sacred, resistance ceases to be political. Resistance becomes a spiritual act. Now, here I touch upon the most fragile point of the entire story. Because Egypt's greatest threat is not direct oppression. It is generational assimilation. And I say this bluntly. The empire doesn't win when it persecutes you. It wins when your children no longer know that they live within it. Ephraim and Manasseh are born in the heart of the system. They are the sons of Joseph, yes, but also of an Egyptian mother. Their language, their education, their symbolic landscape is Egypt. Everything is against them. Everything except for one thing: conscious transmission. That is why Jacob's gesture is so radical. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, as Reuben and Simeon. He says in Genesis 48:5, I hear a theological adoption. He doesn't bless them as grandsons. He incorporates them as complete tribes. He gives them identity before the system can take it away. And then comes the awkward gesture. And Israel crossed his right hand over. In Genesis 48:14, nothing is automatic. Nothing happens by natural order. The blessing requires intention, awareness, decision. The Talmud explains this with a powerful image. In Talmud Bavli, Bava Batra 118b, it says, just as fish are covered by water, the evil eye has no power over them. The fish live within the environment, but they do not absorb it. The water surrounds them. It does not define them. I translate this to the present without softening it. Actively transmitted identity can neutralize even the impurity of the empire. But now I leave the tension open, because it is inevitable. What happens when the Torah is not transmitted to your children? What happens when the next generation no longer receives crossed hands, but empty hands? Don't go, because now you will understand the next 10 levels of impurity. Now we enter even darker territory, because here the system no longer needs new laws. Here it destroys something far deeper, objective ethics. I call these the gates of moral corruption. At this level, good and evil cease to be stable realities. They become relative. They depend on context, on convenience, on power. Violence is normalized, not always as a brutal spectacle, but as an everyday mechanism. The one who can best justify their actions inflicts less harm. The body ceases to be sacred and becomes an object. It is used, exhibited, consumed. Sexuality is separated from any notion of sanctity. It no longer connects, it distracts. It no longer unites, it anesthetizes. And exploitation is legitimized with elegant discourses, efficiency, progress, historical necessity. Here moral cynicism appears. That cold smile that says, that's how the world works. Lying ceases to be the exception and becomes the norm. It doesn't surprise. It doesn't outrage. It's expected. And with it, something crucial disappears. Shame. When nothing is shameful, anything is possible. Abuse is no longer hidden. It is justified. There is always a reason, a story, a narrative that makes it acceptable. And morality ends up being defined by convenience. Good is what serves me. Bad is what hinders me. Egypt represents exactly that. A sophisticated, brilliant, advanced culture, but without transcendent ethics. Much aesthetics, few limits. Much intelligence, little conscience. And I say this with concern, not with superiority. Because when a society loses its sense of shame, it doesn't fall all at once. It slides. And when it finally looks down, it no longer remembers when it stopped calling evil by its name. Now, we read Jacob's final blessings, and we don't hear ordinary words. We hear a moral diagnosis, because the chaos that Egypt leaves behind is not considered accidental by the patriarchs. They recognize it as functional to the system. Gather yourselves together, and I will tell you what will befall you in the last days. Jacob declares in Genesis 49:1. They are not gathered to say goodbye. They are gathered to rebuild what the empire fragments. Egypt fragments families, dilutes roles, and erases responsibilities. When no one knows who they are, no one is accountable for anything. And such systems thrive. They don't suffer from disorder. They manage it. Chaos is not a failure. It's a strategy. Jacob and the tradition do the exact opposite. They define identities. They delineate functions. They mark moral boundaries. Each son receives an uncomfortable mirror, virtues, flaws, and consequences. They do not allow confusion. They do not tolerate ethical anonymity. They do not let anyone hide behind the group. And then they highlight Judah. They present him not as the most perfect, but as the most responsible. The Midrash affirms this in Bereshit Rabbah 98:8. The scepter shall not depart from Judah. They understand leadership not as a privilege, but as a historical burden, as continuity in the face of imperial chaos. This prophecy, of course, is also related to the Messiah, who descends from Judah and whose mission is, among other things, to remove Egypt from Israel and from the world. That is the system. We learn something crucial here. When there is no clear identity or defined responsibility, the system wins without a fight. But when they name, order, and assign meaning, the empire begins to lose power, because its power is primarily mental or psychological, that is, spiritual. And we leave a promise open, because the story doesn't end here. Joseph is still to come, and his role will not be to diagnose, but to show how to survive within the system without being broken from within. In addition, we will study the next 10 gates of impurity, from 31 to 40. Don't go away. During this short break in the middle of the class, we want to let you know that if you would like to make a donation, you can do so by scanning the QR code you see on the screen or by clicking the link below in the description. I personally thank you very much for your contribution. We now enter an even deeper level, because here they no longer attack what you do, but who you are. These are the gates to the destruction of identity, and those who pass through them often don't realize it. Here, ancestral memory is lost. The generational chain is broken. Cultural assimilation progresses gradually, elegantly, almost gently. It doesn't force, it persuades. Names change, languages change, internal references change, and little by little, the spiritual heritage begins to be a source of shame. Children are educated according to the imperial model, not to remember, but to fit in. Collective identity is diluted. The family ceases to be the transmitting nucleus and becomes subordinate to the state. The system decides what is worth remembering and what should be forgotten. History is no longer inherited. It is rewritten, and it is always rewritten by those in power. Origin becomes irrelevant. That was before. That no longer applies. That's not practical. This is how they don't destroy a people with violence. They dissolve them with narrative. Here we understand something crucial. Forgetting is not passive. It is induced. No one loses their identity all at once. They gradually let go of it when it ceases to be useful, convenient, or profitable. That is why every monarch, pharaoh, or dictator manipulates history. And they generally talk a lot about history, because history is the DNA of every people. By modifying the DNA, they then mutate the people. That is why Ephraim and Manasseh become the critical point. They represent the last frontier before total erasure. They are born within the empire. They speak its language. They breathe its culture. Everything would indicate that they should disappear as Hebrews. And yet they do not disappear. Because when identity is transmitted consciously, even the most powerful system fails. But when it is not transmitted, there is no need to destroy anything. The empire simply waits, because time is on its side. Now, we arrive at a decisive point, because here the danger is no longer external. Here it becomes internal. Joseph forces us to redefine what we understand by power. Joseph possesses real power, absolute power within the Egyptian system, which is also an authoritarian system, meaning that Joseph's power was almost unimaginable. He manages the economy, controls the food supply, and decides the fate of entire peoples. And yet, he does not adopt the worldview of the empire. He does not allow himself to be corrupted by its logic. His brothers betrayed him. They sold him. They erased him. And yet, when everything is in his hands, Joseph says something that breaks the script of the system. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. In Genesis 50, verse 20. That is not naivete. It is inner sovereignty. And the text adds something even more unsettling, and he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. Genesis 50:21. The Midrash in Bereshit Rabbah 108 repeats the phrase as if to emphasize the unthinkable. Joseph does not humiliate. He does not punish. He does not exact revenge. He comforts. Here, Joseph neutralizes one of the deepest levels of impurity, resentment legitimized by power. That inner voice that says, "Now it's my turn." Egypt teaches that. Joseph rejects it. And then we understand the principle with brutal clarity. Power does not corrupt by itself. What corrupts is the worldview of the system that sustains it. That is, the system is ultimately neutral. The problem, as always, is us, the people. The real danger is not having power. It is thinking like Egypt while you have that power. And we leave the tension unresolved because the question can no longer be avoided. If Joseph can live like this within the empire, is Egypt really the end? Or is there something more? Don't go away, because we will answer this question shortly, and we will reveal the last 10 levels of impurity. We reach the final threshold, and here they no longer speak of chains. Here they speak of something worse, a slavery that is no longer perceived as slavery. These are the gates of spiritual death. At this level, they accept servitude as normal. They no longer desire redemption. They no longer even imagine it. Hope is extinguished without a sound. Cynicism becomes absolute. Nothing surprises them. Nothing offends them. Nothing uplifts them. They despise the sacred because it hurts to remember it. They deny transcendence because it makes them uncomfortable. They begin to believe that there is no way out, that this is reality, that it has always been this way. Their identity becomes completely Egyptian. The system no longer oppresses from the outside. It lives within them. They adapt completely. The 49th gate is summarized in a devastating phrase: I am Egypt. I don't live in the system. The system lives in me. And then the inevitable question arises: why didn't they reach the 50th gate? Why didn't they cross the point of no return? Because, as Vayechi explains, 5 anchors were still active. Jacob preserved the memory of their origin. Ephraim and Manasseh maintained conscious transmission. The tribes retained a defined identity, that is, their names, Shemot. Joseph exercised ethics while in power, and the oath kept future hope alive. The 50th gate is believing that Egypt is the end. Israel was one step away. They lost almost everything, but they never accepted that. And as long as someone refuses to believe that the empire is eternal, history can still be turned around, because the last thing to be lost is hope. If this journey has given you something to reflect on, we invite you to continue exploring this Parashah and other videos on our channel. Subscribe to Mishna TV. Like, share this content, and watch the next video. Access the free playlist of the complete Mishna course, and visit our digital learning platform at lamishna.com for more information. Remember that I will be answering all your questions that you leave in the comments section. I also recommend the following video to continue advancing in your studies. Shalom.